In today's project, I want to show you this fun shaker card. Look what happens when I move it around. Now I'm going to show you how to make this card, starting with what you need. And I'm using the stamp set called Hello Cupcake. It is in the Stampin' Up! Celebration brochure, and if you don't have one of these, let me know. It runs from January 1st to March 31st, and you can get this stamp set and others for free with a $60 order in Canada, and that stamp set is called Hello Cupcake. So let me show you what other materials that we're going to need, and then we'll get started making the project. So first thing is the card base. So this is an 8.5 by 5.5 piece of cardstock, Granny Apple Green 5 1/4 by 4, a piece of Whisper White 4 1/4 by 3 1/4, a piece of window sheet. This is 3.5 by 3.5. I'm just laying it on here so you can see it better. And then you also need a scrap of white for the saying. The inks we're going to use are Bermuda Bay, Granny Apple Green, and a Versamark. You're also going to use a Wink of Stella. You're going to need a Sharpie or a dark marker of some sort. And I'm going to use the fine tip glue pen from Stampin' Up. And I'm going to use adhesive strips. I'm going to use some micro beads and some actual cake sprinkles, which I'll show you in a minute. And then you're also going to need dimensionals and some snail or double-sided tape of some sort. These are the layering square framelits, and I'm going to need the scallop ones in there, and also the stitched shape framelits, which I need an oval one. So I'm going to start with the big shot, and I'm going to use the magnetic platform and a standard cutting plate, and then I'm going to put down the Granny Apple Green cardstock. And this is a scallop square that I'm going to use, and what I want to do is I want to center it on the shape. Now you can measure this if you want to, but I'm okay with eyeballing it, I think. And because it's a magnetic platform, it is going to stick and hold as I run it through the big shot, and I'm going to cut that shape right out. Now we don't need that inside piece. You could save that for another project. So while I've got the big shot out, I'm going to take my scrap of white and the oval framelit, this one here, and I'm going to cut that out. This is for the saying. This is the stitched shape. These are probably my most favorite dies that I use all the time, is the stitched shapes, because they come in those ovals and squares and circles. Next, I'm going to take my Versamark pad and this cute little flower from the stamp set, and I'm going to go around the whole border. This is going to be the front of the card, and I'm going to stamp these little flowers in Versamark just to give the front a little bit of visual interest without being too distracting, because our main focus is the cupcake and the shaker. So with photopolymer stamp sets, you want to give that ink a second to transfer. I always say let it sit and then seep, and you'll transfer the ink. It's really hard to see with a clear ink like the Versamark, but just give it a second to move over, and that will make it look all good. When you're doing random stamping like this, don't forget to do the edges of your paper, because then it makes it look like it was cut from a bigger piece. So now I'm going to take this piece that I've just stamped and turn it over. This needs time to dry, so we're doing this now. I'm going to take my fine tip glue pen, and I'm going to run a thin strip around the entire border of this square. I don't want any gaps at all, otherwise the shaker bits might fall out. And then I'm going to take my window sheet and I'm going to lay it on top, and you'll see the glue already start to kind of squish out and flatten. That's what we want. So I'm going to use my finger to make sure it is in fact flattened and sticking everywhere. And then I'll need to put this aside to let it dry. Let me show you how to put the cap back on this fine tip glue pen. There's one metal part in the lid here that's wiggly, and that part gets inserted into the metal part in the bottle, and that helps keep the ink from clogging up. So what you want to do is hold the metal part in the lid steady, and then bring the two parts together, and then screw the lid shut. So while that dries, let's stamp the cupcake. I'm going to stamp the top part of the cupcake in Bermuda Bay, and I'm going to go up quite high to the top of this piece of white cardstock. This next piece is this piece here in the stamp set, and it's actually meant to be the cake, and so you could stamp this in a different color, like crumb cake or chocolate if it was chocolate cake. I'm actually going to stamp it in the same color, Bermuda Bay, mostly because I'm only using two colors, and it will just look like an extension of the icing. And the reason they have that is because it's got little divots in it, like on the cupcake liner, so that it lines up perfectly. It is such an awesome stamp for this and doesn't look out of place at all. The cupcake liner and the icing fit perfectly together. So I'm going to stamp that in Granny Apple Green. And one of the other reasons I stamped the top first is so that the bottom would centered on the page rather than centered on the image, because it does have a bit of a shadow, and that shadow would make it not centered. And then I'm just going to add that fun little element to the cupcake as well. Now I'm going to stamp the saying "Sprinkled with Love" in Bermuda Bay as well on our stitched shaped oval. And I just love that saying. It's perfect for a shaker card with sprinkles. So the final thing I'm going to do here is take my Wink of Stella pen and just pull apart the lid, and I'm going to color all the top of the cupcake, the icing, to give it some nice sparkly icing. And that takes just a few minutes to dry. You may not be able to see it on the camera here, but it is nice and sparkly. So I'm going to take a frame that is already dry, and I'm going to take my image that we've stamped, and I'm going to just flip it over, and I'm going to make sure that the image is dry and also that it fits and is centered in the card. My Wink of Stella wasn't quite dry, so that wasn't good. So now I've got it centered, I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to take my Sharpie marker or a pen or whatever you want to use. I'm just going to mark the top and the side, so I've got a reference point to where that needs to go. Then I'm going to take these strips, and I've already cut these ones down to about 2 3/4 of a length, just slightly bigger than the opening, and I'm going to tuck that down. These are double-sided adhesive, and if they're not sticking, it's because there's still some paper on the side. That happens sometimes because they're quite small. It's easy to tear the paper, so just pull that backing paper off, and then it should stick right down to the project. And that's super important. If it's not sticking, you're going to have a big mess. So I'm going to put down 3 of these pieces, and each one I'm going to butt right up against the other one so that there's absolutely no gaps in the frame that I'm creating. This is a frame that will hold all the shaky bits. Now I've just covered up my little marking, but that's okay because it's actually right on that corner, so as long as I can just remember that that's there and I can still sort of see it, we're good. I just know that's where my white piece has to go. Now that piece is just a bit too short, so I'm grabbing another piece, a longer piece from something else, and it doesn't matter if it overlaps like it does here, but it does need to frame it and kill all the gaps. And if it doesn't, you need to pull it up and reposition it so it is absolutely covering all those gaps. You're also going to need a couple of extra little pieces to puff up the rest of the card, and I like using the border pieces from these foam strips because they're not exactly the same size as all the rest of it. So I'm just adding a couple here, and that is so that when you touch that top of the card, it doesn't cave in, so it's all kind of at the same height. So then I'm going to carefully peel off all the backing bits, so now that those pieces are all sticky and will be sticking to our card after. And then I'm going to get out my sprinkles. Now these are actual cake sprinkles that I bought from the bulk barn, and I separated these out a little bit because some of them were really big and I tested them and they weren't going to roll around when they were trapped under the acetate. So I just kept those maybe for something else, and I'm just using the smaller bits here. And I'm just going to very carefully take a little pinch and stick them in the center of this piece, being very careful not to get any on the actual foam strips. And you don't want too much, because if you do, then it's going to pool too much at the bottom and you won't see your image. So I'm going to take the micro beads, and these have a tendency to roll away. So I've just put some in the lid here, and I'm going to pour a very small, very careful pile in the center. And then I'm going to take my piece that I've stamped, and I know that's the top corner and that's the bottom corner. This is what's going to make sure it's lined up. I'm going to lay it down, and then I'm just going to take my finger and smooth all around to make sure it's firmly attached, because I don't want anything escaping. And then I'm going to flip it over and give it a try. It works! Yay! So now I'm going to take my ribbon and I'm going to wrap it around the front of the card. And you want this to be quite long because it's going to go over this bumpy part here. So I'm very carefully going to use my snail adhesive and stick it down on the edges here, and then I'm going to wrap my ribbon around and it'll catch there. I just want to make sure that it is centered on the front of the card, and if not, I would just adjust that. So now I'm going to take the card base and I'll fold it in half, and I'll use a bone folder to get a nice sharp crease, and then I'm going to attach my shaker part to the front of the card. And normally I'd put tape on the smaller piece, but because it's kind of soft and it's got the window and the shaker bits in there, I'm going to put it instead on the front of the card, and just being careful to go inside where that's going to sit, and I'm using lots of tape. You could actually use tear tape here because this is a big heavy element and I want to make sure it sticks, but I just use lots of tape. And the final thing is I'm going to stick the saying on with a couple of dimensionals, and just a couple there, and then it will be finished. Thank you so much for checking out my shaker card. Be sure to come back to stampwithjen.com often for other tips, tricks, and ideas. And if you would like a copy of the Sale-a-bration brochure, just send me a message. Thanks so much.